Hi, my name is Trinity, and welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through church history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History.
William Cowper is considered the greatest evangelical poet of the 18th century. Many of his poems became hymns and are still sung today. We mentioned him in our last episode about John Newton because the two of them worked together as a team, but he deserves his own episode, and I'm sure you will see why if you stay with us here on Kids Talk Church History. I am Grace, I am 13 years old, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I am Sean, I'm 13, and I live in Augusta, Kansas.
And I am Emma. I'm 17 and I live also in Raleigh.
As you said at the beginning, Cowper and John Newton wrote some hymns together. How did that partnership start?
From what I've read, John Newton invited a family who was in grief to move to Olney in England, where he served as a pastor. He offered to host them in his house until they could find a place to live. And that family included a lady named Mary Unwin, her daughter Susanna, and William Cowper, who was like Mary's adopted son. The family found a house next to Newton's, and Newton and Cowper became neighbors.
I've read that they became very good friends.
Yes, and Newton was very close to Cowper during some difficult times in Cowper's life. Cowper lived with an illness that made it very difficult for him to fight negative and depressing thoughts. He was plagued with scary dreams, panic attacks, and terrible fears, especially the fear that God had rejected him. He also started to see and hear things that weren't real, and his mind didn't let him understand the difference between reality and imagination.
That's really hard. I've read some similar stories in the lives of other Christians too.
Yeah, Newton took Cowper into his house until Cowper was well enough to go home, even though he never recovered completely.
I've also read that Cowper wrote his most famous hymn, "God Moves in a Mysterious Way," just before he was overtaken by a panic attack, which led to a long period of depression and confusion.
That is one of my favorite hymns. It teaches that even if we don't understand what God is doing, his purposes are always good, and one day everything will be clear.
I've read that after returning home, Cowper spent his time gardening, doing carpentry work, and caring for his pet rabbits. He had 3 of them, Puss, Tiny, and Bess. He built a hutch for them with 3 separate sleeping quarters and played with them in the garden. Sometimes he allowed them in the house. Puss liked to tug on Cowper's pants and leap into his lap. Tiny loved the indoor carpet. Cowper wrote a long poem when Tiny died and included all 3 rabbits. We can link the poem in the show notes.
I read the poem, and it was one of the saddest things I've ever read in my life.
Well, I think the saddest poem by Cowper, is the one where he describes the death of his mother. He was just 6 when she died, and he heard the church bells and saw a coffin come out of the house. But his mates kept telling him that she went away. So when he eventually learned the truth, it was twice as painful. He wrote a poem about 50 years later entitled "On the Receipt of My Mother's Picture" about her death, and we will also link that one in the show notes.
But not all of his poems were sad. He also wrote a fun poem about a cat that saw an open drawer with soft sheets and thought it was a good place to sleep. But Cowper's maid closed the drawer, and the cat was found 24 hours later. Cowper ended his poem saying that if you think you're indispensable, you may have to learn a lesson like the cat.
His most famous work is a 5,000-word poem in 6 books inspired by a sofa. It was called The Task, and it moved from the origins of the sofa to a description of Cowper's life and of retirement and his local village. He also talked about the evil of slavery and ended with an exhortation to turn to Christ. He described himself as a, quote, "a stricken deer that left the herd," unquote, and was stricken by arrows until Christ found him, quote, "who had himself been hurt by the archers."
Yes, most of his poems were about his faith. He grew up as a Christian, but had many difficult times in his life. One time, when he was in a place for people with mental illness, the story about Jesus raising Lazarus spoke to him in a special way because he realized the depth of Jesus' love.
We mentioned his friendship with Newton earlier, but did that influence his faith?
Definitely. And I read that they actually influenced each other, with Newton learning a lot from Cooper, too.
Cooper's talent as a poet and his deep understanding of the Bible provided fresh inspiration to Newton's ministry. Together, the two men produced a large number of hymns to sing at prayer meetings, a collection today known as the Olney Hymns. Cooper was to Newton a trusted friend and accompanied him to meetings and on regular visits to members of their congregation.
There's so much to say about Cooper, but we really should let our expert tell us more. He's Dr. Andrew Newell, Junior Research Fellow, J.R.F., in Literature and Theology at Wycliffe Hall, and the English faculty at the University of Oxford. Dr. Newell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, how did you first become interested in William Cowper?
Well, I was going off to study or applying to study a master's degree at the University of Oxford. And it was going to be in 18th century literature. And as part of the application process, you have to write a research statement talking about what you'd be interested in researching. And I was really interested in Cowper because theologically, he is what's called a Calvinist, and he is perhaps the great Calvinist poet of the 18th century. And I just thought, well, that would be a very interesting thing to study. I'd be very interested to see how his theology works its way out in his poetry. So that's how I got started.
So when you did your research on Cowper, was there anything that especially surprised you?
I think that the biggest surprise was the first surprise, which was that I read Cowper's poetry, and it was clear to me that this was a man who was possessed of quite a sophisticated theological mind. He knew a lot about theology, but he also seemed to sort of think in very theological ways. And then when I went and read lots of the scholarship about Cowper, written by literary scholars and academics, I was really surprised that they had all missed this aspect about him, and the way that they portrayed Cowper was really as a frustrated poet who had been sort of pushed around by Christians and Christianity, and wasn't really that convinced of Christianity and didn't know that much about it. And they almost portrayed him as a kind of victim of Christianity. And this was just I felt totally false. It was not what his biography or his letters revealed. It's not what his letters, the man wrote hundreds and thousands of letters, and none of them, I think, indicate that. They all indicate that this is a man who knew a lot about theology and who loved the Bible and very much was capable of thinking in his own way about these things. So that was the biggest surprise, was that they'd all missed the point about this guy.
So you touched on this a little bit, but could you elaborate a little bit more on what makes Cowper's poems different from other poets, or even specifically Christian poets of the 18th century?
Well, Cowper is not just a great Christian poet. He is also considered one of the great poets of the 18th century in writing in English. And he influences lots of people with his poetry. I think that what makes him different from everybody before him, and also from other Christian poets as well, is his focus on the minutiae of life, on small things and on their importance, and his willingness to spend lots of time talking about them, and kind of investigating the beauty of these things. And so you've already touched on some of those things. I mean, in the task, the 6 books of the task are, firstly, The Sofa, where he writes really quite a long, he spends a lot of time thinking about how sofas are made and what they look like, particularly this sofa in his living room. He then writes, the second one is on a timepiece. The third book is on his garden. And then he writes about his experience of a winter evening, a winter morning walk, and a winter walk at noon. So he's focusing on these really small, apparently insignificant things about his own life, what it feels like to walk across a frozen field, what it feels like to feel the winter sun on your face. And these are the sorts of things that poets had not previously paid a huge amount of attention to. But for Cooper, God is the cause, in some sense, of everything. And God is sovereign over everything. And God is manifested through every aspect of his creation in one way or another. And so these things, these small things, are very important to him because they're the small things that make up his own life. And he can pivot from them to broader reflections about who God is and what God is doing in the world and has done and will do.
That reminds me, I know he's earlier than like the Romantic poets, but that sounds kind of similar to some of the like later Romantic poetry. Did his poetry influence the Romantics at all, or is he just doing his own thing?
No, you are absolutely right. It very much influenced the Romantics. Cooper is referred to actually as the morning star of the Romantic movement. And all of the Romantic poets read Cooper. They had different opinions on him. So Lord Byron, who's one of the later Romantic poets, he did not like Cooper. But probably the two most significant poets of Romanticism, certainly the two most significant poets of early Romanticism, are William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Both of them, and they together wrote the most famous collection of poetry that came from Romanticism. It's called Lyrical Ballads. It was published in 1798. And they both loved Cooper. Wordsworth really admired Cooper's poem Yardley Oak. And Coleridge was an admirer also of Cooper's work, especially his conversational poems. So yes, he was, and of course, you wouldn't call Jane Austen a romantic novelist necessarily. Maybe you would. She's kind of late Romantic, early Victorian. Sort of, she'd be in that middle period. But people like Jane Austen as well. She really loved Cooper, and she read lots of his poems and his hymns and things like that. Yeah.
So in our hymnal, there are several hymns by Cooper. I did not count before this episode, but there are many. Do we know how many hymns he wrote by himself and how many he wrote in collaboration with Newton? How many total hymns do we have?
So Cooper wrote 66 hymns that were published or 66 of the hymns that were published in Olney Hymns, which is the collection of poetry that John Newton published from that time when they were writing at the same time. He's actually misattributed as writing 67. One of the hymns, which is called Breathe from the Gentle South, O Lord, I think, that is, Newton says, Newton thought that he wrote that, but actually he thought that Cooper wrote it, but actually Newton wrote it, and he made a mistake with that. So he wrote 66. Those are not the only hymns he wrote. He wrote earlier a handful of ones before writing the Olney Hymns with Newton, and those are not included there, and those could be called hymns. And then he also wrote some afterwards that were not published in Olney Hymns either, and those you would also call hymns as well. But there are 66 written by him in Olney Hymns.
Wow. So did he write the tunes, or who did he get to write the tunes?
No, so the hymns then were written in common meters. So there were certain meters that poets would write. If they were writing poems that people could sing, or ballads, they would write in very particular meters that had a certain amount of beats per line and a certain amount of lines in a verse. And so then there were a number of just tunes that you could use for particular types of meters. And so they weren't particularly writing, they didn't have to then write music afterwards or beforehand. They were writing in line with these kind of poetic meters, and then they would attach music to it at a later date, depending on which tune they felt like singing.
Right. So this is why we can sing Amazing Grace to the Gilligan's Island theme song.
That's exactly, well, yes. I guess so. Yeah.
So another thing I know about Cooper is that in the Sense and Sensibility movie, they pronounce his name as Cowper. Is this
Yeah.
a regional thing, or did they make a mistake?
Yes, so Cooper, Cowper, everybody gets confused about that. In fact, I got confused about that because as I was telling you about, before I moved down to Oxford, when I was beginning the process of thinking I was going to do my research on Cooper, I very excitedly told a lady in my local church. Her name is Carrie. I told her quite self-importantly that I was going to be writing on Cowper, and I was very interested in his hymns. And she corrected me, and she said she's a homeschooler, and she knows a lot more than me about a lot of things. And she said, I think you'll find his name is actually pronounced Cooper, Andrew. And she was right. And I'll tell you how we know. Or certainly how I stumbled across, I think, what is excellent evidence that this is exactly as his name is pronounced, which is that John Newton wrote, not every year it seems, but most years, he wrote in what's called a commonplace book, which these were quite normal in the 18th century, and people would write, it's a bit like a diary, and people would write in, who they'd written their letters to, what they'd done that day, what money they'd spent that day. They would just keep a record of their lives. So Newton has a commonplace book for 1767, 1768. And this is, of course, when he met William Cooper. And so on Monday, the 6th of July, 1767, the entry is, and on this day, this is the day that Newton travels to Huntingdon, and he first meets William Cooper and the Unwins. And I found this commonplace book, I should say, in the Lambeth Palace Library, and I was sat there just a few, I think 2 or 3 days before lockdown in the UK during COVID, and I managed to sneak into this library, and it was very important to my research. I was glad to do it because the library wasn't open for another 2 years afterwards, so it felt like very much like a kind of divine providence sort of thing. And I'm sat there and I take photographs of every page, and then I rush home. And so there on this page, the entry for Monday, the 6th of July, 1767, it says in his own handwriting, had pleasure in converse with Mrs. Unwin and Mr. Cooper. I trust the visit was seasonable. And he writes the name with a double O. And this is presumably because he has only heard it said. He's not seen it written yet. And he continues to write Mr. Cooper with 2 O's till he receives a letter from him several weeks later, at which point he changes the spelling to a W. So I submit that this is evidence that because he had only heard it said, he was writing it out in the way that he'd heard it said, which is with a double O. And so his name is Cooper. Yeah, I'm afraid.
That is really cool. Wow. Sense and Sensibility got it wrong.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
That's very interesting. I read a little bit more and I did a little bit more research, and I learned that after his major mental illness attack, Cooper never went back to church. But Newton didn't give up on his friend. When Cooper died on April 1800, Newton preached at his funeral from Exodus 3:2-3, saying, quote, he was indeed a bush in flames for 27 years, but he was not consumed because the Lord was there, unquote. How does this help us to understand with people with mental challenges?
Oh, it's a very good question. So I think that the first thing to say is that Cooper's mental illness is, I think it's often understood by people. So Cooper had seasons of mental illness where he would often be, it would seem to everyone around him as though he was all right. And then one morning they would wake up and he would be in a very deep depression. Often, as you mentioned before, he'd be hallucinating. He'd be sort of acting in very strange and terrifying ways to people who are around him, doing very irrational things. And Cooper had a series of seasons like this in his life. And I would say that they were standalone series or periods of time, seasons in his life, a year and a half or 10 months or something like that, where he would almost fall off a cliff mentally. And then he would slowly begin to recover. And then usually he'd live actually quite a normal life. It seems like he'd be quite happy then for a number of years, and then it would happen again and again. So a lot of Cooper's hymns and quite a lot of his poetry as well, it seems, was written during times when he was not experiencing depression. Now, as to this, what people often say about Cooper, which is that there's a lot made of the fact that he didn't step foot in church after his depressive episode in 1773. I think that, excuse me. So to just complicate that picture, because it seems almost like, gosh, well, did he stop being a Christian? Did he walk away from the Lord or something like that? Well, Cooper continued to buy, so his library, the records of his library after his death show that years after his death, he actually bought lots of theological books on quite complicated theological issues. So he carried on writing he carried on reading theological works. Also, if you read his letters, he continues giving quite deep pastoral faith advice to, especially to young men. So in the 1780s, he writes a lot to his cousin, John Johnson. He writes also to William Unwin, his young friend, giving them advice about how to be a Christian, giving them advice about how to be, about how to carry on in their vocations, as pastors. They're both training to be pastors. So this is a man, and then he also, in addition, also wrote some hymns, and he also edited a hymn collection afterwards. And as you've said, but also as you can read yourself, in all of his poetry, pretty much afterwards, he references God. He often pivots to theological reflection. So I think that ultimately what Newton is saying here is that God kept hold of William Cooper, even if William Cooper didn't always keep hold of God in his mind. And what Newton is trying to say is that therefore we can trust that we'll see him, we'll see Cooper in the new heavens, the new earth, and that, Cooper's sometimes lapsing and sometimes not quite being able to attend, church, which he wasn't for several decades. You're right. I think it might have been too painful for him or too socially difficult. But this is a man who very much kept involved in the life of faith, I think. And those are 3 pieces of evidence there that I've given you for that.
Wow. Honestly, that's just a great message, especially for people who battle with depression. But besides Miss Unwin and Newton, did anyone else care for Cooper and stand by him during his most trying times?
Yes, a number of people. So I think firstly, it's just worth saying that Mrs. Unwin was extraordinary. Mrs. Unwin didn't sleep in her own bed for a couple of decades, because when Cooper fell ill in 1773, he had his main depressive episode then. He couldn't sleep alone because he had night terrors, and so she would sleep in a seat at the foot of his bed. And if you go to his bedroom in his house in Olney, which you can still go to, it's a museum now, and you can see what the house looks like. It's a very small room, and she is just sat over in the corner, and so she slept upright there next to him. Cooper then ends up going to the Newtons' house, and he actually stays with the Newtons for a year, and they are caring for him as he is having terrible panic attacks and as he thinks that he's being poisoned and all these different kinds of different fits that he's having. They really looked after him, and Mrs. Unwin kept sitting next to his bed for the rest of his life, even though she herself became terribly ill. That, in the end, by the way, ends up really hurting John Newton's ministry in Olney, because he's spending so much time looking after his friend that he ends up not being able to go around and see all of his parishioners. And this is really one of the things that contributes to him in the end. The people of Olney sort of feeling like he's not caring for them properly, and he ends up moving to London, although, of course, when he moves to London, he becomes involved in the abolitionist movement and brings an end to the slave trade, or is involved in the group of people who bring an end to the slave trade. So as to your question, yes, his cousin, Lady Hesketh, moved in with Cooper in 1793 and looked after him. He also had a number of servants who were very faithful to him and stayed with him. There was a poet. He went on, I think, to become the poet laureate, who's called William Haley, who was a very faithful friend to Cooper and actually secured him a pension of £300 a year in 1794 from Parliament, and so that kept him his head above water, so to speak. And then, of course, there's his cousin, it's the Reverend Dr. John Johnson, and Cooper ends up going to live with Johnson. Johnson was the curate at St Nicholas Church in East Dereham, and Cooper ends up living with him, and he looked after him and his sister, I believe, looked after Cooper till he died. So yes, he had a lot of people who were very faithful to him and looked after him and helped him.
Wow, this guy is getting cooler by the second. Like, I'm not gonna lie, he's becoming one of my favorite poets. But another question I had, did anyone dismiss Cooper's works because of his mental illness?
In a way, they did. I mean, I've mentioned already that lots of literary critics and literary scholars dismiss the theological aspects of his work because of his mental illness. His earliest biographers actually tried to hide his mental illness from his readers, and so lots of the edited collections of his early letters and things like that, they removed any letters that had reference to his mental illness, and also to his Christianity as well. In the 19th century, there's a real battle over Cooper's legacy, and lots of people are writing lots of different things about him, some claiming that he was mentally ill, some claiming that he wasn't, and people speculating on different reasons for his mental health. So his mental health has been a topic of real conversation, but I don't think anyone has dismissed his work entirely because of his mental illness. No. If anything, that's made people more interested in reading it.
What is your favorite poem or hymn by Cooper?
That's a great question. I think that my favorite hymn my favorite poem by Cooper is just The Task, which is, is a bit of a cheat answer really, because it's lots of poems, but it's a really wonderful piece of work. Also, I love The Yardley Oak, and a number of his smaller, shorter poems as well. My favorite hymn, I have a number of hymns I could have chosen as his favorite, and there are a few that are quite famous, and so you'll know about them already. One that is a real favorite of mine that you might not have read or heard of is a hymn called "Jesus, Where'er Thy People Meet," and this is a hymn that Cooper wrote as the evangelicals who would meet at this home group, and this is what they wrote the hymns for. They would meet on a Tuesday night in Olney, and they moved the location. They actually moved the location of this meeting several times, but for one of those occasions, Cooper wrote a hymn for their first meeting in the new place, that's this hymn. And just the first two stanzas, I'll quickly read them. It says, "Jesus, where'er thy people meet, there they behold thy mercy seat. Where'er they seek thee, thou art found, and every place is hallowed ground. For thou, within no walls confined, inhabitest the humble mind. Such ever bring thee where they come, and going, take thee to their home." And I think that's one of my favorites because it's a beautiful poem. As you carry on reading it, it's very well written, but also because it really captures this thing that is very important, I think, in the Bible, and which the evangelical revival really picked up on, which is that the message of the Bible, the message of the gospel, is that you must be born again, and that the story of the Bible is in part, about promises that God makes in the Old Testament, particularly in Ezekiel and in Joel, where he says that there is a new era of history coming where God will come and will make his home within individual people by the Holy Spirit. And what nobody realizes as they're reading is that this is tied in with the coming of the Messiah, who will make a way for that to be possible. But the basic message of evangelicalism, which is you must be born again, what that ends up meaning is that when people are born again, God is with them, and God is no longer therefore tied to an institution. God is no longer tied to a building. You carry God, the Holy Spirit, around with you, and you yourself are transformed into a temple of the Holy Spirit. and you yourself are able to then communicate with God through his Son by his Spirit who dwells within you. And so I think that this captures this idea really beautifully, where he says that wherever the people of God meet, there they can see the mercy seat of God. There they can encounter God, because God is living within them. And therefore, every place that Christians go becomes hallowed ground, because God is dwelling within them, and God is transforming everywhere as they go, and God is everywhere accessible because he's with them. So I think that would be why that would be, I think, my favorite that you might not have heard of.
Well, for our final question, we like to ask all of our first-time guests, if you could meet anyone from church history, who would it be?
I think, William Cowper is obviously high up there. I'd like to sort of show him my doctoral thesis and say, did I get this right? And have him say, absolutely, Andrew, and he could sign it. And, that would be a great book deal that would come out of that. I think I would also, I cannot wait to meet and chat with the Apostle Paul. And so if I'm allowed to choose somebody from within the Bible, I suppose, I should also say as well, Jesus Christ, can't wait to meet him. But the Apostle Paul as well, from church history, can't wait to pick his brain. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Newell, we are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And listeners, keep telling us what you think of these episodes and keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. So make sure you check out our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org. And for the opportunity to win a copy of Simonetta Carr's biography for kids about John Newton, which includes many details about Cowper's life, visit our website and enter the drawing. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Sean and Emma, I am Grace. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.